that we're adapting to, and that I'm confident that we will succeed. However, another area where there's been challenge, Zoom, this platform that we're using this evening, has also met its challenges in its usability on a school district front. While I know some school districts are utilizing it for instruction and student interaction, it has yet to be approved for use in the state of New York. There are data privacy and security laws under Education Law 2D that have to be complied with from a school district standpoint. And right now, Zoom as a corporation is in negotiations with New York State to see what they have to do to be able to meet those standards. So we're optimistic that that will be resolved in the not too distant future, which would allow us to use it on a much wider scale than it's been piloted recently. And the other holdup I would say associated with Zoom has been that there's been a growing phenomenon of what is called Zoom bombing, that when we have participants, such as our community members that are watching from the outside, when we have an interactive session where we would have all members invited to participate, those folks from the outside, so you could picture a student being on the sitting on the periphery of this meeting, with me being a sole host or facilitator, that those outside parties would be able to share their screens. There were numerous reports of inappropriate actions that were occurring where outside parties, not necessarily the students in a given class, but somebody would acquire the access information to a site and would display inappropriate information that certainly would be problematic. Zoom has just put in a control to fix that over this weekend. So that hurdle looks like it's been cleared. So we're down to the final two important ones. And one is state ed and New York State getting that certification consistent with Ed Law 2D. And the next piece is that evolution of the work of our teachers and the comfort level in utilizing the technology. But I'm confident that we're going to arrive in a place where we're going to see much more engagement between students and teachers across the district, and it'll be done in a more uniform manner. And looking to other things that are certainly happening, as a district, we are providing meals free of charge for every Irvington student. If a child receives free or reduced lunch, of course they are eligible, but we're also extending that opportunity to every one of our students. We have distribution that is taking place every day, Monday through Friday, at Main Street School between 9:30 and 11:30, and then in Tarrytown Crossing, formerly known as Talleyrand, in the parking lot near the playground. On Fridays, we are also providing meals for the weekend. And if there were to be time where we had actual closures of the school, we would try to ensure that that meal service is provided. In partnership with Dobbs Ferry School District, we are running the required childcare program for children of first responders and also medical professionals. We sent out communications related to that and have had community members sign up. So we're proud of that partnership. You know, this effort, along with that of the meal service, really demonstrates how our school districts are being successful within this crisis, how our districts are collaborating to support one another. Our meal program is also being done in partnership with Elmsford. So just two examples of how school districts are rallying around one another to help deliver these critical and important services. As I communicated earlier today in a letter that went to all school community members, per the governor's recent executive order, we have to forego spring break. So in doing so, we will continue to move forward next week with distance learning. But the one challenge that we do have with that is knowing that we're running into a week with a number of religious holidays, and we have staff members that will be observing those given holidays. So it is their right to take personal time to participate in their religious observances. So we know we're certainly moving forward with our plan, consistent with what we have submitted and was approved by the State Education Department. But we also understand that the latter part of the week is going to pose some challenges. Thus, we should expect daily instruction, certainly Monday and Tuesday. And as we move into the latter part of the week, we have to understand that there's going to be instruction and learning that will continue, but access to teachers will be limited during that period of time. But we look forward to continuing to communicate. It has been my commitment to communicate with our school district. I've done so in writing at least twice a week. Just recently, I started my first Facebook Live session, which was attended by about 75 people. This Friday, I will have another Facebook Live update for our community at noon, so I invite you to join us. Just hit our Facebook page at facebook.com/Irvington UFSD, and you will see the live broadcast at noon on Friday. The one thing I guess I would say in summarizing where we are is that it's an ever-evolving situation, as you well know. You can tune in and watch the governor, you can watch the federal task force, and to see the challenges that we face. While the governor has closed schools for another 2 weeks, we should anticipate longer closures, and as that information becomes available, I will continue to share it with the school community. But our great hope is that the situation is under control, that our friends and neighbors are well, and that we are back in school sooner than later. That said, I certainly want to send out my thoughts and prayers to all those who are affected by this terrible disease. We certainly have members of our community that are fighting and are successfully going to overcome the coronavirus. But we should be thinking of all of those in our community, as well as our family and friends that are being impacted by this. And then finally, a thanks to our first responders, of course, the doctors and other medical professionals that are out there giving that first class care to all those that are ill in our region and across the country. But we're going to keep on going. We're going to continue to grow with this process. But I have tremendous confidence in the ability and the dedication, which I cannot underscore enough, the dedication of our faculty, staff, and administration who are working around the clock to provide quality experiences for our students as we move forward. That said, we recognize that there's going to be a lot of moving parts moving forward, and I certainly remain dedicated and committed to communicating with this school community each and every step of the way. Thank you, Brian. So next up, we have committee reports.
Unmute myself.
Mm-hmm.
So as Dr. Harrison said, we'll now move on to committee reports, and we'll start with B and G, and I'll start with that. And as always, Ms. Stein will supplement and correct whatever I may get wrong. So the B and G committee has continued to meet during this time, and we've heard that all of our projects, with the exception of the final Dow's Lane bathroom project, have been submitted to SED. So that's the good news. The, I guess, other news is that we don't know exactly when SED is going to be acting on all of them and how the coronavirus is impacting their turnaround time. We know we've heard from them on the Dow's Lane boiler and received word back on that, but the other projects, we don't know when we'll be receiving comments from SED, and we don't know how that will impact our hope forward construction over this summer. It may be that projects will get pushed back, and that we're just gonna have to wait to see what we learn from that approval process. But in the meantime, we're pushing forward with our work to get the projects there and be ready once we get approval to go ahead with them. Some of the projects, if they miss the summer, are things that may be able to be completed during off hours and weekends. Some may not, but I think it's a little too early for us to start thinking about what may or may not happen in that regard. Carol, did I miss anything?
No, I think I'll chime in. I think, Brian, I think you did a fair job, and certainly thanks to the committee members for their continued dedication and meeting with us from afar, as well as in person when we needed to, one given time, with some significant social distancing, might I add. But I think that was a fair update.
Thank you. Dave, do you want to update us on the curriculum committee? I think you're muted.
We were scheduled to meet tomorrow. However, we're postponing the curriculum committee meeting until further notice based on higher need moments. So we don't have an update at this particular time.
We did meet back a couple weeks ago. Do you want to update on that?
I thought we briefed them on that last time.
Yeah.
But okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We did have a communications committee meeting this week that didn't meet, the date didn't make the agenda, or the end of last week. I don't know if the committee wants to provide an update there. Maura, Michael, Beth?
Michael, do you have access to your notes right now?
Well, I'll just remind you, since Brian asked, the curriculum committee, just to remind everybody from the last meeting, we discussed the beginnings of the development of the professional development plan, the beginnings of the data plan, and those were the things that we updated the community on. So just as a refresher for those folks.
Thank you.
On the communications committee meeting last week, so we discussed the fact that we were going to delay the survey, obviously, since school isn't currently in session. That's going to be something that is moved potentially to the fall. We talked about the fact that the district Instagram account had been started, and we discussed some feedback on the current communications around the emergency closures. So how the district website plays a role in that, and making information easily findable. Would anyone else like to chime in on some of the other topics that we addressed?
We're starting some new communications during this time. One of them is a Instagram page for the district, which I encourage people to share and join. The district is currently encouraging community members, our students in particular, and their families, to send photos of what distance learning has been for them, and a lot of great photos being shared. And then our esteemed superintendent entered into digital video with a Facebook Live recently that the audience grew exponentially over the course of his talk, and he shared a lot of up-to-date information at that time, and I believe you'll be doing more of those, Dr. Harrison?
Yes, this Friday at noon.
Excellent. So even in the midst of this crisis, we continue to move forward in terms of our communication tools.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Maria, do you have an update on CAB?
The meeting was canceled.
There we go. Do we have an update from the last IEF meeting?
I believe the meeting was canceled as well, but we should give their shout outs to IEF on facilitating a wonderful fundraiser back at the beginning of the month.
Yes.
Thanks, Chris.
Sorry, Ernie, you guys gonna say?
No, I just said thank you because I couldn't get quick to my device quick enough to unmute.
Okay. Beth, were you ready today for an update from the West Putt, or is it Michael who's giving the update on the last West Putt meeting on?
Michael has access to the documents on late start time, so he's gonna.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes,
So
go ahead.
Yes, the We belong to the Westchester Putnam School Boards Association, which brings together school boards from around our region to both in terms of coordinating around advocacy and also lots of opportunities to meet over the course of the year to learn about our role on the board and to learn about current issues. WestPut, as it's called, is also has a start time committee, which is related to a number of school districts around the country have been considering the research related to the benefits for secondary and primarily high school students with later start times, with I think the key time being suggested that high schools ideally start around 8:30. At this conference, there were about 35, 40 attendees that included several members from Irvington, including our trustees, Erin Bernstein, Beth Proper, myself. And it was great to see Mary Ellis, our ASI, there as well. So we were definitely very engaged in this conversation. The presentations or speakers were Lisa Brady, who's the superintendent of the Dodge Ferry School District. They had moved their school start times for high school forward a few years ago. Their intention was to get to 8:30. They've made it from time around 7:40, 7:50 to about 8:15. Another panelist was Andrew Selesnik, who is the superintendent of Katona-Lewisburg School District. And there was also a principal from Putnam Valley High, Sandra Venturi, and so they shared their experiences. There's, again, significant research. Hopefully many of us have seen the articles and that share that research about the benefits for our teens. They include that when you don't get enough sleep, that leads to more depression, impulsivity, anxiety, athletic injuries, quite a list, more traffic accidents. So sleep is really important. More sleep leads to better attendance, less tardiness, improved engagement in school and resulting grades, and improved standardized testing. So a lot of reasons to really look at it seriously. But the benefit of having these superintendents and our and the principal present was to share some of the operational challenges, which include some of the obvious ones. It's more challenging for school districts who have transportation systems like Irvington. You have to look at what the impact is to buses. And that can mean, are we having to put older and younger students on the same bus? Some districts have looked at buying buses. We have to look at the impact of traffic to the community. Another obvious one is after school athletics. And if you're trying to get to another school district to participate in a athletic game, a lot of times by moving the school later, your end of school time is later as well, and so you have less time to make it to those events. There was discussion about coordinating with changes in schedule, the master schedule, which was the case in Putnam, and where they also added a community lunch. There was discussion about basically in each of these districts that it had been, a positive outcome by and large. That so I think one of the superintendents described that these high schoolers seemed a bit less zombie-like in the morning compared to prior to the change. So there's a lot on our end if we want to continue to look into it, again, around, what our, we have a resource that we can draw from WestPut. One of the presenters shared the research they had done, which basically showed or demonstrated what the start times for high schools around our region are. And so that's very helpful for a comparison basis. And obviously we have those same people that we can reach out to in terms of lessons learned and recommendations if we want to go forward with it. And we've talked about previously, we have some money set aside for a transportation study, and this might be something that we have discussed in the past, using transportation study to look at that aspect of how it could potentially work if we were looking at that. And certainly, you know, to the degree that our discussion and the initiative moves forward with our consideration of master schedule, you know, it would make sense probably to discuss or look at the start time in relationship to that potential. So I don't know if Aaron or Beth or Mary, thanks again, Mary, for coming. If you want to add some thoughts or some things I might have left out that you want to make sure to add, I invite you to do so. So Beth, you want to go first? And you want to take it? Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. So I just wanted to point out for anyone who's viewing who wants to look at it, if you go to www.wpsba.org, which is the Westchester Putnam School Board Association website, you can get access to all of the PowerPoints that were presented at the meeting that we attended, and that there seemed to be a strong level of interest regionally in a number of school districts learning more and moving forward in this area. That's all I wanted to say.
I think you did a good summary, Michael. You did a good summary.
Thank you, Michael. So at this point would be where in our agenda we have our community comments, but given the nature of tonight's meeting, we've asked everyone to please email any comments you may have to us at our board email address, which is board@irvingtonschools.org. And as we do with all such correspondence, we will respond, and a response will be posted for public viewing. So with that, I turn over to you, Dr. Harrison, for tonight's presentation.
Great. So just bear with me as I take steps to launch this. Alrighty. So good evening. So this budget process is one that has hit some detours along the way because of the crisis that we are facing here in our region. And but along this way, we have followed our normal process. So tonight, we are presenting a budget presentation, and this is the superintendent's proposed budget. And a budget that typically the board would be asked to vote upon on April 14th. However, in the governor's recent executive orders, it was noted that school elections and associated with school elections is the budget vote will be postponed for a date to be determined and a method to be determined. But as of now, that date has been set as June 1st. The legal guidance that we've received and the guidance from New York State school boards has indicated that this process, the timelines and the like will be developed in the coming weeks based upon the progress that's being made in fighting the coronavirus. So when we think about our process, there's going to be more steps, and likely you'll see some modifications to not only voting timelines, but potentially voting process. And what that may look like, we don't know at this point in time. But this evening, I am going to walk through a presentation that's going to be kind of done in two phases. One is where we are ready essentially to be able to present a recommendation going back at the last Board of Education meeting. And then since that time, we found ourselves in this difficult situation. So about midpoint in the presentation, you're going to see me pivot. And as I do so, I am going to be really beginning to reflect on the challenges that we're facing in the United States and globally as it relates to economics. But I think it's important for us to spend time focusing on our process and honoring the work that has been done, not only by the administration since really November, but the board thus far. So to begin, when we think about where we are as a school community, I think the idea of what our vision is holds true today more than ever. We remain truly dedicated to supporting all of our students and doing so in the best learning spaces possible and While now it may be their homes, we know that they will be back in school, hopefully not too far off. But in doing so, we hold true to these commitments that we have. We looking at maintaining quality learning environments. We think about having high quality, trained professional staff, and in doing so that they are fairly compensated. But we maintain a strong eye on the fiscal health of the school district. And in doing so, we're looking at what we're doing from year to year and also considering the long-range impacts of everything that we do on a daily basis. And this budget process really is going to begin to highlight that eye on the future. So not just thinking about being mindful of our tax rate for the 2021 financial year, but thinking of the impacts of the school district budget on future years. So that said, when we face these fiscal challenges, we need to make sure that we always ground ourselves in the district priorities. And in doing so, we focus on our strategic objectives, which are outlined in our strategic plan. These are items that community really should be familiar with. I know the board and the administration and our faculty and staff are well versed in them. Everything we do is grounded in this work. We start the school year by presenting and outlining goals, and each of those goals are linked right back to strategic objectives by number. This makes sure that we're grounded in all the work that we do. As we go through our budget development process, and if we look back to the two prior budget meetings, you'll see that budgetary recommendations are all aligned with these strategic objectives to ensure that we're grounded in that commitment that we have here in the Irvington schools. So as we work through this process, you can see the meetings that really kind of play to where we are today. Unfortunately, our last meeting was canceled because of the initial closures in the school. And right now, as I said, April 14th is noted as the budget adoption day, but we fully expect that rather than having an adoption, that on April 14th, we're going to have another workshop with the Board of Education where we're going to be working towards a final plan and having extended conversation based upon what I present and we discussed this evening. And then ultimately the dates that follow for the election and vote will change as well. That said, through this process, the board is given a charge, and it is a part of the fiduciary responsibility as trustees to determine what the fiscal ceiling is for our budget for this year, looking to make sure that we're monitoring and managing responsible growth, and that when we need to do so, we're going to have to make adjustments to ensure that we have a sustainable financial future. So each of the upcoming meetings that we're going to have are going to be really, really important to make sure that we're dialing in on priorities, making sure that those priorities are aligned to our strategic objectives. But ultimately, we're going to be having lots of conversation about balancing student need, the quality of experience that we afford our students here in Irvington, along with our fiscal realities. So that said, our budget is presented essentially in two different components. The first is the business and operations, and you can see outlined before you the different categories that are summarized there. Really, this is the back end of the school district in a lot of ways. The operational side that we really don't see impacting kids. It's not out in front, but it is something that is crucial to every student's success. Then we moved into curriculum and instruction, and this is essentially where we would say the rubber meets the road. In doing so, this is where the bulk of our expenses lie. It looks at all that goes into instruction. So this is our teachers, our aides, supplies that go into informing classroom work, our library and media centers, our guidance services, of course, instructional technology. And I should note that technology is broken out into two different areas. There's an operational piece that sits under the operations budget, and then there's the instructional technology front. Curriculum and professional development, supervision, so that speaks to our principals, all of our administrative staff at the school and department level, and their office staff and supplies, extracurricular and interscholastic opportunities for our students, special education, and then pupil personnel services, which is a larger scale umbrella that looks at health services, meaning our nurses, our psychologists, and the district social worker. So each and every year as we go through this process, there's variances that occur that are natural. So before we get into even considering anything new, any new initiatives, needs that are going to surface from year to year, there's going to be growth in expenditures that will occur. They fall into a number of different categories. First, the most obvious being salaries. Those salaries are really governed in large part by collective bargaining agreements that are negotiated with the administration, the Board of Education, and the respective bargaining unit. And here I have to say that our board and all of our bargaining units have come together in recent years to develop fine, responsible agreements that not only compensate our employees well, but really keep an eye on the district's fiscal future. We also think about related services for students with disabilities. And there's certainly costs that are associated with delivering these services. And while many folks may not know, the John Cardinal O'Connor School right at the base of Heritage Hill is essentially a private parochial special education school. And under law, we are required to provide special education oversight that occurs there. So Irvington provides a nurse for the program, as well as oversight of all the CSE, Committee on Special Education meetings that occur. Some of the services that we put in, we can bill back to the districts of residence, but really the time that goes in sitting outside of meetings, the organization, the leadership that comes from Ms. Krieger and her office, it really is borne on the back of the Irvington School District. When we think of out-of-district tuitions for our students with disabilities, there's increases that occur annually there. Equipment needs that naturally surface associated with just the safe operations and the efficient operations of our school districts. We are a member, obviously, of BOCES, and there's cost increases in the services there. Notably, though, aside from salaries, the other real large area of increase that we see each year, or an area that we have to be mindful of, is the area of benefits. So here we look at a number of different categories, but most notably we look at pension rates. So the TRS rate, which is for our certified personnel, and the ERS rate, which is for non-classified personnel, and looking at the rate of increase that happens there. We're in a relatively healthy position this year and looking at where we see the increase for a rate that has already been set. And I want to repeat that, a rate that has already been set for the 2021 fiscal year. But when we look to the years that go beyond that, in 21, 22, we know from looking at how the formularies and the rates are developed that we're going to have a strong performance year come off the record, and then we're going to have this difficult year come on. So in doing so, we need to begin to anticipate that we're going to see significant increases moving forward for at least 1 year, if not longer, beginning with the 21-22 school year. Health insurance is another area where there is exposure. We are in a tremendous health insurance consortium that has maintained rates with high level of service for our members. That has beat all industry averages for a number of years. But based upon this crisis, there's a great deal of uncertainty that's going to come before us. So when we look at where we are, just these push ahead variances, so before we even get into considering any new considerations, those asks, those wants to continue to advance our strategic objectives for the district, we're looking at a push ahead variance of $1.8 million for this coming school year. So in this process that I referenced earlier, we went through and we reviewed each of these series of considerations and dove deep into the finances with each of the components of the budget that I referenced before, first on March 11th and on March 3rd. And following those proposals, we found ourselves in the position when comparing where our push ahead budget was and the additional considerations that essentially we had a deficit of nearly $30,000. So following that last meeting that we had on March 3rd, the administration went back and recalibrated some priorities and needs. We incorporated some new information that was coming forth. We started to consider what was happening with COVID-19 and what the impacts were at that time, and wanted to make some adjustments. And as that last bullet indicates, we started to ask ourselves, what if? So if we think of where we were back on March 3rd, we're in a very different place nearly a month later, exactly 4 weeks later. So you can see how things have shifted. And as a matter of true transparency, we wanted to outline this process for our school community. In looking at where we were and considering the challenges that we suspected were on the horizon, we started to draw back some of the revenues that we rely upon. First being interest earnings, we drew that back by about $10,000, recognizing that the Fed was beginning to cut rates and beginning to talk about rate reduction at that point in time. So we drew back monies that we were going to see on interest. Also knowing that the crisis was going to, and we didn't realize at the time how significantly, have an impact on the economy. So we would see a reduction in our sales tax revenues. So we drew that back nearly $16,000. On the expenditure side, we realized the savings here that in this area of special education tuitions. Here's an area that is really student sensitive. We have a student, let's say, and these are hypotheticals, of course, where a new student moves into district, could have needs that we could not have foreseen, and the district would have a legal opportunity to provide services to be able to support the education of these children. Or we could have children internally in our district who are identified and eligible for services. So those can be new expenditures that hit a school district budget. We always try to plan and provide for some flexibility in an annual budget to support those changes. But at the same time, as you can see before you, there can be shifts where we had a situation where one student moved out of district. So we're realizing a cost avoidance there. But then we saw some special education rate adjustments. New York State sets tuition rates for some state-approved schools for previous years, and they make adjustments, and they can occur at any time. And essentially, out of the blue, Ms. Stein's office could receive invoices essentially for back tuition, and this represents that we had an increase in past tuitions or an obligation of $15,000. So here we're looking at net savings of $55,000. One area that we discussed back on March 3rd, associated with an initiative, was tied to expanding our one-to-one device initiative at the middle school to our 9th graders, essentially allowing our 8th graders to take their devices with them to high school and purchasing a new set of devices for our 6th graders when they arrived in the middle school. Through our process, we have acknowledged that we actually had not budgeted for that, so there was not a cost associated with that. So at this time, we're actually going to dedicate a little more time to developing our initiative, and would anticipate coming forward with a presentation to the Board of Education next year that would ensure that we have a well-informed, well-designed experience for our high school students prior to launching that initiative. Certainly, the conditions that we're moving into fiscally may add additional pause to that, but that is a commitment that the district is making at this time. So when we look at really the net of these budgetary adjustments, the prior slides that I just reviewed, we're seeing the series of adjustments that we had in a scenario where we made some reductions in revenue. We had some reductions in expenditures, and at the end of the day, we net out with a revised deficit that's right at our tax levy cap, or projected cap, with no deficit. But we're looking at an amount, a sum for our new considerations, a figure that was just shy of $500,000. So when we look at where we are and a kind of a summary of the different components that I reviewed thus far, we had the 1920 budget as the foundation, the $1.8 million of push ahead costs, the new consideration, which arrive at a proposed budget of $65,257,500. And note that this includes those prior adjustments that we had. So you may ask, what's in that nearly $500,000 of considerations? Through our budget process on February 11th and March 3rd, we presented a series of needs, again, with all of which were directly linked to our strategic objectives. And in here, we came up with a list of items that were of top priority. And of course, there were many, many other items that did not make this list. But those that I would say made this round of cuts were including the items presented before you. So in doing so, you can see what they were and focus on some new facilities equipment, a much needed vehicle, a pickup truck for our facilities department, which had been discussed in the last budget year, as well as during our capital project process. A shared services security consultant. This is a partnership with another school district that would support the district's implementation of all the new security measures in the coming year. Additional business office clerical support, which is much needed to ensure the efficient operations in our school district. An additional social worker. If you have interest in learning more about the social worker, I would encourage you to go back to look at the January Board of Education workshop, where we had a two-part workshop. One was on instructional resources and the other was associated to social work needs, which are dire prior to heading into the COVID-19 crisis. But currently, I think the needs are even greater than they ever were based upon all that we're dealing with today. Remaining true to the commitment that the Board of Education and administration had made, entering into phase 2 of the expansion of our elementary world language program. An additional aid for physical education at Main Street School. This was a matter of safety and security due to the fact that the gymnasium at Main Street is a separate isolated building and that we only have one adult there at any given time with our students. So this was a health and safety measure. We are looking at opportunities for program enhancements through some new advisor stipends. We had to purchase and replace new scoreboards in the campus gym. They are beyond the end of their useful life, and our wonderful custodial and maintenance staff were able to nurse them along through this school year. Additional coaching stipends to support growing student interest and needs in our athletics program, and the addition of a PE health chairperson. So that said, all those proposals certainly aligned with all these initiatives that you see before you, connecting with our students' needs, being true to our strategic objectives. And at the end of the day, certainly we are presenting a plan that was fiscally responsible and one that was compliant with the New York State tax levy cap. But that brings us to where we are today. We could look at the situation of a coronavirus or any other crisis that could hit a region, and school districts need to be nimble. School districts need to be able to respond and to think about how we can adjust our finances, how we can plan to be able to sustain the high quality education that we afford in our students and the education which they deserve. And is also reflective of the investment that our community makes so heavily in its public schools. But we have to maintain that eye on the fiscal health of the district looking long-term, and we can't do so with any single one-year fixes. So that said, we took a look at this in a couple different ways, and first looking at the 2021 school year and seeing what impacts we see on the horizon for us. So earlier in the presentation, I had referenced how we drew back investment interest. And so the monies that we have in the bank, we receive essentially the money from our tax rolls, 2 equal payments throughout the school year. And as that money comes in, it obviously goes into the bank and we earn interest on that. And it's all very responsibly and wisely invested by Ms. Stein and her staff. But right now, we're recognizing that we're going to see a possibility of a significant dip in that interest that would go beyond I think it was $10,000 that we identified earlier. The sales tax revenue, we're also looking at a larger reduction on that front. We don't know where we're going to land. There are some economists that will tell us that we'll see some spike in this front when folks are able to start to return to their regular lives later this spring. And that we would see employment begin to recover a bit, but we're seeing some additional risk on that front. One of the real unknowns, aside from that, is what's happening on the state front. I'm sure many of you, like me, have been following Governor Cuomo's daily press conferences. And not only does he update us on what is happening with the fight of the virus and the care for those that are sick in our state, But he also is talking about the state budget on a consistent basis. So by state law, the state legislators and the governor are to agree to a budget by April 1st, which is obviously tomorrow, and we're not there with a budget. But what we have seen is the governor talk about a different approach to budget. We've heard him talk about significant budget gaps, deficits in the range of 10 to $15 billion, ranges that are actually much higher than we've seen the comptroller publicly release within the past week as well. He's talked about managing the district budget in a very different manner than we're accustomed to. And rather than setting the budget in one fell swoop for the state's fiscal year, which is inclusive of school funding and state aid, which represents about 6% of the school district budget, that doing so on a quarterly basis and making adjustments based upon the state's needs. So when we take a look at the state budget, we need to be mindful that the single biggest investment that the state of New York makes with its budget is through its public schools. And the area that we're struggling the most is one of the areas that may be underfunded in looking at the healthcare system. So as we're hearing the governor, we got to kind of read between the lines that money's going to have to move around. Certainly the stimulus funds that are en route from Washington, D.C. to Albany may provide some relief here, but we're really uncertain as to what that may look like. So as we look to the projected revenues, this is where we stand today with the projections that we've maintained, and highlighted in yellow are those areas that are highlighted as the risks for us. So when we think of state aid and a figure that was anticipated to be just north of $4.1 million, we should have concern as to whether or not we'll receive all of those monies, whether that is the increase that we're demonstrating here or modeling of $200,000, or if that is even looking at the number from this current fiscal year of $3.9 million. Sales tax, I referenced before, and the other figure largely is due to revenues associated with our interest income. So this is an area that we'll dig into a little bit more on an upcoming slide as well. So as I said before, we've been taking a look and spending a tremendous amount of effort as necessary to review our finances for the upcoming year, but we also have to take a look longer range at the 21-22 school year. And what are those different scenarios that could play out? So when we look initially at our tax levy and the factors that really work into that formula, we have to think about the growth rate in our community, which could be low. And if we came in with showing no growth in our school community, there would be an increase in property ratables, we would have concern. If we were to see ourselves in an environment where there was a 0% CPI, and when you think of CPI, that's a consumer pricing index or inflation, that would be of concern. So think about where we are today, right? We have a frozen real estate market. We have really very, very low inflation, if anything, because of where we are with the lowered interest rates from the Fed. So the worst case scenario, we'd be looking at a tax levy increase that would equate to only about $37,000 growth. So that would be a real challenge for us. But if we look at different scenarios, you can see them played out before you. If we look at the current growth rate and the flat or zero CPI, you can see a levy increase of $1.1 million with an average growth rate of 1%. Which certainly would be down from where we are today, and zero CPI would be an increase of $575,000. And that's just looking at our local tax levy. So when we think about that, that would just about cover our contractual employee obligations associated with salary, which we estimate to be ballpark of around $600,000 annually. But considering that bigger push ahead number, when we thought about where we were last year of a number of $1.8 million, this $575,000 doesn't come close to being able to address that. So if we found ourselves in that position, we would have to consider program adjustments. We'd have to consider how we operate as a school district. And there would likely be reductions that would have to be contemplated across the entire district. Some other factors that we have to keep in mind, we'd be looking at this TRS, ERS contributions that we're required to make. As we said, this is directly tied to fund earnings on a state level. And we look at a budget risk for $325,000 for each 100 basis points increase. So if we see an increase of a full point here, you can see how that $325,000 could impact our expenditures. And similarly, we have exposure when it comes to healthcare costs. And here we'd be looking at a $50,000 increase for those 100 basis points as well. So when we think about back to where we are right now and our conversation and thinking about the upcoming school year, our 2021 fiscal year, we have to think about what opportunities there may be here for us, what immediate challenges there may be here for us. First and foremost, if we were to look at a situation where there was space between what our budget was and the tax levy cap formula, there's always talk about that ability to carry forward unused cap. But in reality, for that to be applicable here in Irvington, we would have to be in a really tough situation, as outlined here before. And even to arrive at that place, you would see we would have to have a multi-million-dollar reduction within our budget before we could even become eligible to be able to carry cap to future years. When we think of the reduction of tax levy for this coming year, in doing so, we have to be mindful that that would have a compounding effect on future years. So essentially, we would be starting with a lower base. So when we think about being able to support our needs longer range, essentially that pot is less and less full as we move forward. And we'll actually have some illustrations associated with that that I'll review with you. The annual increases based upon the lower tax levy number slightly reduces future increases is something that needs to be noted. So there's like kind of both sides to this argument. But at the end of the day, based upon current numbers, if we were to look at a tax levy cap reduction this year, so essentially coming in roughly $500,000 below the tax cap, we'd be seeing these fiscal impacts that are outlined on the screen. The reason that we modeled $500,000 here is because that it almost equates directly with the number or the cost of the considerations that I had presented to you earlier. So here's an illustration. I'm going to pause and allow everybody to take a second to process this a little bit. And if we are looking at two different scenarios, and these scenarios I have to note is you should review the assumptions that are at the bottom of the screen. And assumptions that we've made with respect to growth factor and CPI in each of those years. So these are modest numbers, but numbers that may be a little grander than they should be based upon the direction the economy may be heading. So if we were to go forward with the full tax levy for the 2021 school year, you could see where we would end up theoretically looking at the 21-22 school year and just anticipating and modeling those salary increases and benefit increases that we know of, that you can see a figure of $1.25 million, $1.025 million, and looking at where we would be and coming out in a much healthier position. If we chose not to go to cap this year and made that reduction of the $500,000 that I suggested on the prior slide, we would be in a position where we would, in 21-22, we just in paying our employees, not looking at any of other operational cost increases, we'd be seeing a deficit of almost $450,000 before we even started. So this highlights just looking at what we know today and only looking at the incremental increases in salary and benefit for our employees, none of the other cost drivers that were outlined on the push ahead budget variance slide earlier in the presentation. I also, before I move on from this, want to put in the back of your mind that we need to keep in mind that we're looking at revenues that are uncertain. And so if we have uncertain revenues, that we need to be able to have a plan to be able to adapt to them And what I will propose to the board and the community this evening is moving forward with the full tax levy, but having a plan that allows us to be responsive and to be able to be responsible with this coming year's budget to be able to invest in future years as we move forward. So these strategies, they begin now, and measures that we've already enacted here in the school district. And frankly, Carol, Mary, and I discussed this with our administrative team this evening in advance of the board meeting, that we are we have frozen any discretionary spending to further generate budget surplus, which will certainly flow to our fund balance and our respective reserve accounts. In doing so, we're looking at some cost drivers that may not be there because of the closure of the schools for this period of time. And when we're looking at where we're going to go big picture, this is an opportunity where we could have significant surplus at the end of this school year based upon, in reality, sadly, how unfortunate the situation may become. So when we look at cost avoidance, we're not paying substitute teachers during this period of time. We do not have, currently do not have school buses running, and contractually, we do not have an obligation to make those payments, and legally we cannot make those payments based upon our contract. Should that change from direction from the government, we will have to consider that with legal counsel moving forward. But when we look at all these different expenditures that are out there, we have to think that this is money that's not going to be spent. So when we consider that, that is all monies that we can put aside, monies that we can invest in future years through our reserves. Also, we've taken a new look at our considerations, and we've done it in two different ways. One, showing priority and breaking that list that I believe the board and administration was largely aligned around going back to March 3rd, but breaking that into two different tiers, and then taking it to another step, which I'll discuss tonight. And then finally, that ongoing review of programs and expenditures, seeking efficiencies and reductions where possible. I'm just taking a drink here. So when we think about our reserve funds and our fund balance, there's different funds that exist within our school district's finances. The first is our tax certiorari reserve. As noted, this is to satisfy legal judgments or refunds for tax cert claims within the boundaries of the Irvington School District. Being a small district, we have a very large number of tax certs, largely due to the corporate parks along the 119 corridor. So when we look at this number of $1.5 million, I want to assure our community that our exposure is far greater than that. And so when we look at $1.5 million, don't think of the district having deep pockets. Think of the district having some funds to manage a portion of these tax certs from year to year. This is an area that when we have surplus at the end of a school year, that we always, the board always invests and makes deposits to support future claims. We have a workers' comp reserve that is used to pay past claims. This is a necessary fund to be able to satisfy the requirements that grow out of the workers' comp process that's managed by the state and county. We have a capital reserve account that we started going back, I want to say about 5-6 years ago. In doing so, this is a fund that is exclusively dedicated towards the capital investment in our facilities. But different than all of the other reserve funds here, this is an area that has restrictions that require to go to the voters of our school community to approve the expenditure of these funds. The other funds, the board can utilize to support its real operational needs through appropriate transfers that would be noted and discussed at the board level and of course reflected in action on board agendas. We have an employee benefits fund, which is set up to look at contractual benefits due to employees upon retirement. We have new this year, something that the board created, and we are glad to be able to have the opportunity to create this reserve account for the retirement funds. This was something that the state just enabled us to do in the past year, and you see we made an initial deposit of $50,000. This would be an area that the administration would recommend that the board invest in if we do realize a surplus at the end of the school year, as I had referenced earlier. By making sizable deposits into this particular fund, that will help us deal with future increases that we're going to expect in the increases related to employee benefits. So this would be an area that would be a critical area for future investment to help sustain our budgets moving forward. We have assigned fund balance, which is appropriated fund balance, which essentially is shifting money from our unassigned fund balance to support the operational costs from each year. The last few years, we've used that 422.5 figure as the number here in Irvington. And at the end of the year, we essentially replenish that money by making a deposit back into the unassigned account. And then we have assigned encumbrances, which essentially monies that are carried over for expenditures from one fiscal year to the next that will be paid out in the following year. And then finally is the unassigned fund balance, which you can see a number of $2.5 million. This is maintained at the 4% level, which is the recommended level. If you drop below that number, it does impact the district's borrowing rates. So when we go out for borrowing, whether it is, we can use our capital project, for example, if you do not have that full 4% there, we are in a position where we'll have to pay higher interest because the district would be considered to be at a greater risk. Additionally, the Office of the State Comptroller, OSC, annually reviews school districts' fiscal stability. And I'm proud to report, and kudos to the business office and everyone that works in that office, that we received glowing reviews from the Comptroller's office again this year. So when we think about that list of priorities, going through this process, our first pass was taking a look at where we stood and breaking them into two different categories, first being priority one, the latter being priority two. And while they're not necessarily listed in a priority order within the categories, we've identified the areas of greatest need for us here in the school district. And just to highlight those in priority one, it is the social worker. It goes without mention that we have tremendous need, that we need that additional support there. Facilities vehicle, we're essentially down a truck. And if we had had a real winter this year with typical New York snowfall, we would have been in trouble there. And that's an expensive truck, as you can see, because it actually is our salt spreader that carries the weight of the spreader and a whole bed of salt. So that's a significant vehicle. The security services that I referenced before, coaching stipends, the additional clerical support, and the school scoreboard, which we saw as a necessity. But moving forward and now reflecting on the reality that we now live in today, made a different recommendation. And this is the recommendation that I now present to the Board of Education and our school community, is that one, we take the full cap and we have a budget that is compliant with the cap, that utilizes all of the available resources to the school district. But in doing so, we do so with great discipline, and we do so in making decisions as we move forward, as our fiscal realities become much more clear. And in saying that, I want to provide a little bit more clarity. I want to go back to what I talked about earlier with respect to our revenues. Tremendous amount of uncertainty. If we think back to, I think it was slide number 17 with all those highlighted bars on that spreadsheet, those areas of state aid, those areas associated with other revenues, sales tax and interest income, there's big question marks there, folks. And when we think about what those question marks were and those exposures that we have, we're seeing a number in those scenarios that we've modeled there that could be north of $500,000. So in doing so, we need to utilize these funds to be able to balance our budget. We need to utilize these funds that we would raise through our local tax levy to be able to offset the reduction in those other revenues that we ordinarily would count upon. So therefore, my recommendation is that we would proceed with only one additional consideration at this time, and one that has grand need. That is the addition of another social worker K-12. And all of those other priorities would be put on hold. And just as Governor Cuomo is saying that we're going to deal with the state budget a quarter at a time, well, we can look at these items in priority too, and we can see how we can tackle them based upon what our known fiscal reality is at those given times. At the end of the day, we may step back and say, geez, out of this, we're in a position where we're going to see $390,000 that we're going to hold on to. And we're going to use that money to do one of two things. One, offset missing revenues because of the financial situations facing the district. Or two, we may want to put these monies aside to be able to save them for future years, just as I suggested we would do at the end of the 1920 school year. So real difficult decision points to be made, but my recommendation is for us to be very responsible, to move slowly, to not invest in these other initiatives. There's going to be challenges. We got to be straightforward and honest. We may have to look at different opportunities for plowing our roads and spreading salt. Rather than purchasing a truck, maybe we need to lease a truck. We're going to have to forego the security consultant services. We're going to have to look at other means of supporting the needs in the business office. We're going to have to turn to our community partners and say, can you help us purchase a scoreboard that we may need if we're unable to fix it any longer? And unfortunately, we would have to forego the additional world language teacher, and to be considerate of the fact that we don't want to hire somebody only to have to let somebody go down the road or introduce a new experience to our students that we would have to take away if our finances took a turn for the worst. So in sum, we're looking at a situation here, folks, where we're thinking about today, we're thinking about tomorrow, and then we're thinking about the day that follows that. We're outlining plans to be able to maintain a responsible, fiscally secure budget for 2 school years, and that work begins today. That work is looking at how we manage the closeout to this school year, preserving every free dollar to support 2021. When we think of the 21-22, I'm sorry. When we think of next year, the 2021 budget, when we see what our fiscal reality is, to find those opportunities, one, not to only make sure that we have a balanced budget, that we're preserving all of our reserve accounts for use in future years, but where possible, that we're going to save every extra dollar, that we're going to be extremely frugal, that we're going to save monies that we can then carry forward to the future years and make those investments in our reserve accounts as I had outlined earlier. So a little bit of a summary slide here in looking at the overall categories of the budget, where we see the budget variances and how the representation of where they fall within our budget. As always, and we always highlight this in a school district budget, when we look to where that investment is, we're people's business, right? What we do, the investment is in our staff that delivers services and support our children and educate our children. Therefore, we look at a situation where our budget is 72% people and looking at just salaries and benefits. So here's an overview of our projected tax levy cap. And, you know, when we look at this, you know, this is looking at the numbers that are available to us today and seeing where we can grow our cap and where that growth is for next year. And you can see that net increase of $2.1 million. These are the funds that consistent with state law that we're able to raise from our community. And it comes back to the points that I was making before with respect to taking full advantage of the funds available to us going into the next school year. Our projected revenues, we've done a lot of chatter about this already. You can see some of the shifts that we have in those projections. We talked about the vulnerabilities that we have with respect to state aid, sales tax, and the other category where our interest inventory is housed. Where we're seeing declines there in tuition, that's because we do not have a few students continuing in some of our special ed programs because they've aged out or their needs were greater than that which we could support here in Irvington. And then looking at the projected revenues. And this is something that we have to think about. Being an affluent community, a Westchester community, you think about how we fund that budget. 90% of that budget comes from our local taxpayers. We get state aid of just over 6%, and those other little slivers of the pie don't add up to all that much. So realistically, when we think of times of a budget crisis, we're going to be in a better condition than maybe some of our larger school districts or those that have a lower socioeconomic status where that state aid portion of the pie is much, much greater. But regardless, that figure, and if we flip back and we think of those revenues, mind you, that state aid figure we're looking at a figure of around $4 million. So that is a significant component, and we need to keep an eye on that and listen to what the governor's saying, because we should expect adjustments on that front. So a comparison of our revenues and expenditures, and I'll allow you to process this, really kind of merging the last couple slides and looking at the work that we've done to arrive at a balanced budget. We're looking at, you can see the budget variances that have occurred before the considerations and following the considerations. And again, a tax cap compliant budget. Looking at our budget trends. So this is looking back over a course of a number of years. We certainly need to note that we go back to looking after the 16-17 year. That's where we saw the adjustment that happened due to the local reassessment. And I want to highlight and note the asterisk that we have related to our local tax rate. The town has been slow in providing that information, and we're just beginning actually this evening to get data in from the town regarding tax rates and the overall assessed value of our community. So I fully expect that we'll be having a conversation around this number at our next Board of Education meeting on the 14th, because we know that there will be adjustments based upon data that's coming in. So utilizing that rate that we identified there, and again, that's based upon the September 2019 tax rolls. You could get an idea of what your taxes would look like by looking at your assessed value and multiplying it by that factor, and you could do your own math to be able to determine where you would fall, and recognizing that the tax rolls are always finalized in August as we move in the new fiscal year. Again, we anticipate more conversation on this at the next Board of Education when we receive more data. And I'd also say that we're going to receive much more data when it comes to state aid, and we'll have a better sense of where our exposures may be on the revenue front at that point in time. So tonight's an opportunity for discussion. Still on that state budget calendar, we see the 18th is the 14th of April is the adoption date. But as I've noted on the slide in my comments earlier this evening, we've been told that the trustee election is moving, and that the budget vote will move with that. Our legal guidance has told us to hold on taking ads in newspapers and do all our legal filings that we have to do each year while we wait for a new timeline. So that new timeline is forthcoming. We just don't know what it is. Based upon the guidance that we've all received, we should expect that the board will not be adopting a budget on the 14th, but we'll be having another conversation that will be fine-tuning fiscal numbers and priorities based upon the new data that we hope will be surfacing in that period of time. So just really that timeline that is again to be modified. So we take a look, we had developed our regular schedule of going out and talking to our school community, answering questions and communicating our priorities and needs here in the school district. And as you can imagine, looking at this screen, a lot of time and energy went into the part of my assistant and partnering with so many folks in the PTSA and other community organizations to make these opportunities available. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like they are going to happen based upon the challenges that we have before us today. But as we move forward, I'm committed to providing opportunities for more public engagement. I will host Google Hangouts or more Facebook Live sessions that will directly connect with the budget as needed moving forward. So that said, Mr. Friedman, that's all I have to say for a little bit.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. As he mentioned, the board will certainly be having additional meetings to discuss this prior to the adoption. And with that, though, I do want to ask the trustees if they have some initial questions or comments for Dr. Harrison or Ms. Stein on it. So I will go down our proverbial row and recognize each board member to have either questions or comments. And so Maria, if we could start with you, if you have anything.
Right now, I actually don't have any questions. Other than my comment, I do appreciate all the work that you guys have put into this presentation. It's definitely different than with your priorities 1 and 2 and the idea of putting on hold and still spending up to the tax cap as what I think people would understand if I say it that way. I mean, I know that this is very conservative. I'm not sure I agree with all of how you've broken this up, but I think it's wise. I lived through the past when we made a lot of cuts because there wasn't anything really in the budget to cut other than programs and things that actually really did hurt education, and we've been restoring a lot of those cuts over the past number of years. So I do not want to see us go back that way, which is why I think this is a smart presentation from that point of view. I don't want to repeat of what we lived through and what we've restored. I do not want to see cutting teachers. The board made a commitment to early world language, and I understand why you're making that recommendation. And reluctantly at this time, I think I agree with that. I really don't think there's anything else to say other than thank you.
And if I could, Brian, I could just respond to something Maria said. I really want to be clear that I'm not thrilled with all the recommendations that I've made. When I think about our commitment to our strategic objectives, our commitment to opportunity and program growth. But I think what I'm proposing tonight is what I see as a responsible measure considering the uncertainty of our future.
The one thing I do want to add to my comments is earlier you reported we are saving some money now that unfortunately we are not open. Do you think we might have an idea as to what that savings might look like by the time we possibly have another discussion?
Yeah.
Roughly.
I think some of it would depend on the requirements that we would have in and around transportation obligations. As I indicated earlier, right now we're not contractually not required and legally not permitted to make transportation payments for services that are not being rendered. Essentially, our buses are not on the road. So when we consider those issues, you step back and you look at where we are, we could see ranges of, depending on how long schools are closed, and if we don't have that obligation to pay, we would be looking at a reduction in state aid because of a reduced transportation expenditure. But we could see anything from, if we were to reopen May 1st, we could see anything from, let's say, a figure of roughly $750,000 to something that would be over $1 million that we'd be able to carry forward to next year. That would be in addition to replenishing the 422 that we have in our fund balance allocation every year, and increasing our fund balance to the recommended 4%. So when you think of those other categories that we have, you could be looking at a number of roughly $800,000 to greater than $1 million that we'd be able to invest in those different reserve accounts.
Thank you. Maura?
Hi, thank you. Thanks to everyone in the administration and also to teachers for how hard everyone has been working in these past several weeks. Sorry about that. So I thank Maria too for her questions on when we're going to understand these things. And I wanted just, Chris, to hear you repeat what you said at the end of the meeting first. We could potentially know what state aid might look like by the time we are voting on this budget, or we could have a better idea of the direction it's going by that time?
I would say more of the latter would be more accurate, in that we will have a better sense of what we need to do, where we're headed. I think we have to follow the lead of Governor Cuomo and indicating that he wants to take an approach where he's reviewing the state's financial obligations on a quarterly basis, and recognize that we could see flux throughout the course of our school year. So I would fully expect that we'd have a better picture of where we're going to be financially, and that would be looking at those revenues at the next meeting without question. I think we will have direction from New York State and state ed that will influence that. We'll also have updated and revised numbers from the town to have a better understanding of where our tax rate will accurately fall and what its impact may be for our community.
So if that's, if these revisions on a quarterly basis, rather than knowing upfront what our aid looks like, would we then have to look at the other priorities in our in this budget in a similar way?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say?
I believe so. I believe so. You know, I had the recommendation to move towards just the one consideration of the social worker at this time, and I think we would keep those other funds in our coffers and to be able to respond to the shifts that may come our way, whether that is initial reductions in state aid, additional reductions in sales tax that may be projected. And if we're in a position where we hit midpoint in the year and we're in better shape than we thought, maybe we want to invest in a couple of those smaller items. But I think we need to proceed with caution to make sure we have the funds available to be able to support and sustain operations through the course of the school year. I never want to be in a position where we would have to consider mid-course corrections and make modifications or eliminate opportunities to our students during the course of a school year. So by having that in our in the bank, so to speak, I think we would be in a position to be able to lead responsibly as a unit, that's the board and the administration, and really make adjustments to our finances and our planning in response to the adjustments that the governor will be making.
Thank you. Could I just add on to that then, saying what would the function be, or what would the approval process be like on a quarterly basis for making those expenditures, if the funds already exist for them and we have approved them at year end?
Mm-hmm.
So is my question clear then?
Yeah, I believe
along
so.
Later,
Yeah.
how do we, how are they already approved, and it's just up to the administration to fit them in if possible?
No, I smile because we're in this together, and this is a decision that we'd be making together in this process. I would liken it to some of the experiences that we had this year, that there were monies that were set aside for the 1920 school year where we didn't have clear direction on some of the pathways that we were going to take. So in those areas, what I did, I articulated my initiatives with the Board of Education, and we added separate resolution on board agendas for expenditures from those particular categories. So moving forward, I would see us in a position where if we were to move forward in the ideal situation and you were to approve the recommendation that I made this evening, that we would move forward, and after our budget was adopted, we would begin to recruit another social worker, but we wouldn't do anything else without public conversation, significant analysis on the part of the business office, and also looking at you know, where our priorities may fall. So that would be a public discussion. That would be what I would recommend that we would act would be similar to this year, that we would approve those expenditures via resolution to make sure we're being totally transparent to the school community and that we're being consistent with the commitment that we're making today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Michael?
So Dr. Harrison, Carol, and Mary, thank you, and anyone else who was involved in developing this revised budget. Clearly, it's very different than it was a month ago in terms of the direction it's taking, and we live in a different world, the largest economic contraction in history happening. A couple of quick questions and then some bigger thoughts and questions. In our presentation, there was the reserve balances as they stood at the beginning of the year. Is it possible to get what they are currently? We must have paid some tax certs and other things along the way.
Carol, can you respond, please?
Oh, the mute.
You're still muted.
No, now I'm not muted. Michael, so we have taken some money out of the tax cert reserve and the workers' comp reserve already this year. So that number has come down. In fact, I think I actually have that number. We've taken about 675,000 out of the tax cert reserve and 150 out of the workers' comp already. I do anticipate putting that money back in at the end of the year with just our basic surplus that we would normally have. Then if we have a larger surplus, as Dr. Harrison mentioned, we would be able to fund, I'm hoping the TRS ERS reserve, because that would be the key one for planning going forward. The EBLAR reserve is pretty much in good shape. I would actually not fund that anymore. We are dwindling with those kinds of responsibilities as contracts have changed over the years. So that's money, we just let that one go out. And the capital, you know, that's the one where we can make decisions on it in as we go forward, what we can put in there. We've been modestly putting that number in every year, but this may not be a year we fund it, or we only fund it, again, modestly. So really the key one will be the TRS ERS reserve, because that's going to help us the most in the future. The tax cert reserve, yes, I'm always worried about that. But that is also a reserve we're legally allowed to borrow for. So if we really found that we couldn't fund that reserve for any reason, that is one where we could potentially borrow. All the other ones we really can't.
That's a good point related to the tax certs. Thank you for adding that. Another question, and you partially answered it with Maura's last question, but the funds that were initially new considerations that are being proposed to be put on hold, technically, where do those then go in the budget? Are they being held in one of the reserves until we decide to move it back into the budget, or where would that be?
Well, the funds would stay in the actual budgeted funds. So the expenditure budget would be that full amount. But remember, you always have to know that, you know, a budget is a plan and your expenditures have to equal your revenues. So as we've said numerous times today, if our revenues fall short, we can't spend the full budget. So then you have to put brakes on it. For example, you know, with facilities budget every year, I'll just give an example. We budget a certain amount for facilities projects, but I don't let our director of facilities use all that money until, you know, partially through the year, until I've seen what's happened. Because if we have some other catastrophe happen and I have to spend money on that, we don't always spend it until toward maybe like the spring. We say, okay, we've had a good year, nothing's really happened, we can go ahead and do those things. So there are things that we kind of keep on hold throughout the year as a matter of course. I would certainly recommend doing something like that in this coming year. You know, like I've talked about the interest risk. There are some ways we can mitigate the interest revenue loss. Our treasurer has already done for us this year, putting some money into a CD and locked up a decent rate. It's a 3-month CD. We can continue to do some of that. So it's not completely bleak. there are things we can do, and those things take time to investigate, to figure out. And that's why it's still a little early in this process to really panic. I think we have to plan. We keep a plan for the budget for what we wanted to do as a district, and then we look at the realities of what's happening, what we've generated in fund balance, what we see is happening on the state aid landscape, which is the one that concerns me the most. And then we go from, as Dr. Harrison mentioned, a quarter by quarter basis to see where we're landing.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if it's easy to pull up slides. I just was going to reference the one that Carol was so helpful to put together, which is the scenarios of spending the cap and not spending the cap. And I just, my main question was in regards to those new considerations. In the two scenarios, we look at the incremental push ahead costs from one year to the next. And in those scenarios, the numbers are the same. But if we were to fund some of these new considerations, wouldn't those potentially or likely impact those incremental costs in a future budget? I mean, so if we don't do some of those considerations, the push ahead cost stays flat relative to not doing them. But if we do fund some of them, some of those incremental costs would actually go up.
So in that scenario of the
It's not this slide, by the way. It's
I know, I'm getting to it. I'm looking at it on paper to find the right number.
19, in slide 19, in that situation, I modeled using the push ahead salaries of the social worker, and I think probably the maybe not the world language teacher. So I've included the social worker in the scenario, only the priority one recommendation in both the scenarios. You know, this assumes that we would have that person in both, because that was in the assumption that we were making for the priority one. But yes, if I didn't fund that one worker, that would be one less. But it's really the increment that you're worried about, as opposed to adding things, because then you would have to take them out in the following year. So this particular scenario, the 600,000 includes the social worker, does not include any other incremental salaries.
Got it. So it varies. That push ahead varies by who's being hired or not hired.
Correct.
But let me just, I want to clarify that though. The push ahead where we're talking about the incremental salaries and incremental benefits,
yeah,
that doesn't change materially, because that's talking about the entire unit and just the contractual increases in salary and projected benefit increases, correct?
Right. For example, if you hire a worker today, the incremental salary might only be $500 to $1,000 in the following year. So it's not, you're not going to save $100,000 in this scenario, to Brian's point. It's only the incremental salary, because that number would have been in the base in 2021. So actually, technically, I'm sorry, I'm going to answer that question differently now. The number of the 550, the 65, 257, 500 does include all of those push ahead, all those recommendations. So it includes both positions at the moment, right? And so then the incremental salary would be the two pieces above that, would just be the incremental salaries above that. So you're correct, Brian. But if we don't spend it,
I think what Michael's trying to say is that it's compounding, Carol.
Yeah, it's compounding.
It's compounding, which you can't totally tell on here. I'm sorry to interrupt.
But it's a small amount, to Brian's point. The incremental piece is a small amount for those two positions.
No, it's compounding on the revenue side, because if you have an extra $500,000 that we don't, or let's say 400,000 that we don't actually spend, that we tuck away in reserves because of the instability, that extra 400,000 that we budgeted in 2021 that we didn't spend is included in the 21-22 number, and we're probably not spending it there either. So it's compounding. So you actually have you actually have money in there that you're not spending. So the deficit's probably not really the 442. It's probably 142 or something like that. But I can't remember what the tier 2 options were.
So
I think that's what Michael's trying to say. Is that what you're trying to say, Michael?
Well, I think it's a great point. That's a different one, but I think that's a great
okay.
So, but all that is going,
correct.
if I may ask, it's all going with the assumption that we receive all these revenues that are in here, right?
Yeah.
So if we
that
don't
actually-
receive those revenues, right, Aaron, and
Yep.
we're anticipating we're not going to, we're going to spend it this year to
Yes.
balance the budget in 2021. We're going to spend it to balance the budget because we're going to lose state aid or other revenues. So the money's likely to be expended here. But when we think about moving forward, there is, if it's not, and if we're fortunate enough, we may choose not to invest in other considerations. And then we would have that opportunity to potentially carry forward to support in 21, 22.
Right.
And, yep. and-
Aaron, if
Can
I
I
could just
jump
ask you
in?
to hold your questions until we
Sorry.
get to you, because it's going to get unruly. So let Michael finish, then we'll go down the line. And if you have further follow-up, we'll deal with it then.
I appreciate
Michael,
it,
go ahead.
but it helped me identify another aspect of this, which is, I guess, a key part of another, maybe a bigger, more important line to focus in on then is the two scenarios. In using the levy, it's really important to key in on the words it says, but not expend. So for those considerations, if we set them aside or put them on hold or whatever language we'd like to use, we can then also at the same time talk about using those funds, because then that scenario is a different scenario. So I think when we get obviously we'll need to dig into this probably a little bit more in a future discussion, so I won't spend too much time with it, but we can't, but the point being that in this scenario, the key is that if we set aside those funds that would have been used for new considerations, we have it available in a future year because we didn't expend them. So if we use them, they're not there. So I think that's an important line in that scenario.
Michael, I agree with that, but I also would state that, as Dr. Harrison mentioned, if for some reason our fund balance is significantly higher this year, that would also be a way of, in a sense, holding money aside for a future year. So there's two options, really. We have to continue to keep both of those in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So I want to just, as others have noted, thank you so much to everyone, our teachers, our staff, for the work they're doing. This is unprecedented for everybody, and to suddenly be working in a new model is incredibly complex. It's a new paradigm, so we can't ignore that. And I want to thank everyone and our families that are also adjusting to this. I think, as Maria mentioned, we have our last recession that we can look to. I think the federal government's already handling it somewhat different. It's a different scenario, but also we can look at how we can handle it. But also our degree of difficulty is a lot more challenging, just as we were talking about with those scenarios, because we're working within a tax cap that didn't exist before. I do want to say I appreciate the work that you've done to make adjustments. I do think that we have to be ready for some really challenging times. The governor has said that. He's literally said there's zero money for education. Even the relief bill that the federal government passed, there's probably very little that's coming to Westchester districts like ours. And as you said, Dr. Harrison, the next time we look at this document, our state aid number may be different. I want to say I'm supportive of this approach, but going back to that do not expend line, I think part of our discussion going forward has to be to dig a little deeper for everyone into that lower revenue, the zero CPI, the increasing contribution to the pension funds, which can all be very significant. And so there is some latitude we have with this budget that we may not have in the future. And I think hedging against that by putting money into reserves, whatever comes out, as we sometimes said, shakes out at the end of the year. But also with what we're doing here with the budget is really important. And so I'm being supportive of this approach generally. I'm not supportive of saying we are funding these items that are in the new considerations. I'm supportive of spending to the cap, trying to maximize our reserves so that we're not in a position, as Maria was pointing out, where we're cutting in things that we don't want to cut in future years. And I understand, Dr. Harrison, you're saying that there may be adjustments along the way based on the reality of the time that we take into consideration at that point. But that's different than saying, I support those tier 2 considerations. What I support is maximizing our reserves. So I hope that we dig into that some more together as a board. And I thank you also, Chris, Carol, Mary, for, like you've done with the new considerations, that with this extra time to look at our push ahead. Just, if there are items that we can see that when push comes to shove in a tough environment next year, we would end up cutting. Maybe we should be looking at those items now, rather than expending the money on something that we won't be able to support because of this difficult environment. So I thank you for taking time, and I look forward to hearing what you come back with in terms of that. I also would ask us as a board and administration to consider what we might do as a district or as a region in terms of working to better support public health. I'd ask us to reflect on what we've done, these significant capital projects related to safety, and now we're seeing that this pandemic is the biggest thing we've seen yet. And there are, as I read news articles about opportunities, I think things that we could look to, some which may be a part of the budget, or maybe just about working together to help us, because there's a lot of discussion that this may carry over into next year in terms of the numbers increasing again, potential school closures, all sorts of scenarios. And I think it would be worthwhile for us to see if there's anything we can do to help ourselves on that front going forward. So at the end of it all, I think the goal at this point is to manage the risks as best we can. And so when it comes to the proposal that you have, Dr. Harrison, I would simply want to try and reframe it towards, as Carol was saying, putting what we can into reserves to hedge against some difficult years in the future. If we look back to the past recession, the pension contribution increased. It's a 5-year average, so it takes several years if there's a negative year or two for that to hit, and our contribution can be significant. So it's not just, when we think about this budget, it's not just about this coming year, it's about the next couple years, I think, and being strategic about it. And I think that's what you're doing, and I appreciate that. And I just think we need to really hone in on that. So thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Start off by saying thank you, as always. I think this is the 4th budget season I've sat through, and it never fails to impress me how thorough and cautious and for the people we are. So thank you for the diligent presentation. I only have 2 real questions as related to, one's more of a request. Actually, they're one's a question / request, one's more of a thought. The first one is, so for the security consultant ask, for the EWL teacher ask, which we should already have from last year, for the PE health chairperson ask, and I don't think it's necessary for the coaching piece, but just like I asked last year, would it be possible, please, to provide the job descriptions, not the postings, but the actual job descriptions for those positions? That's question number 1. And thought number 1, or
Mr. Graber, can I just pause you? So I just want to make sure we get them all. So security, you said you also wanted the
EWL, which we should have from last year, right? Because we did that, and then the PE health chairperson, just to have them on hand while we think about it. The second thought is, I just want to throw my 2 cents in, because I had heard earlier, the example you gave, and I'm sure it's not the only example of places where we might have to think about making changes, based on some of the conversation here this evening. And I would just throw my 2 cents in the ring in regards to, if we're in and obviously this is a gigantic if, but I just want the board and the administration to think about the amount of work that we've spent over the last, before I was even on the board, but for the last at least 4 years plus, the effort and dollars and training and we put into STEM and put into Project Lead the Way as our base STEM program, K through 12, before we start to build out a new program that we just started last year that is really in its infancy completely. I just would, ask, and this is obviously I'm a huge champion for the early world language program and believe very substantially in it. However, I just, and this is not to say that you would make these cuts. I just want us to think about if we're in that position that it would, in my opinion, behoove us to become greater experts in that which we've been building and been lauded for around the county as before we commit further investment into something we just began. That would be something I'd like folks to think about. And that's my 2 cents. Again, thank you very much. Look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you. Beth?
I had to get to my unmute button. So yes, of course, to Mary Ellis and Carol Stein and Dr. Harrison, thank you for all your work on this budget. I also just want to take a moment to thank the teachers who, just like all of the people all over our region who are trying to juggle working from home, are doing the same and providing instruction to our students. With that being said, what I really appreciate about this budget is your maintaining the option to have funding for a new social worker for next year. Because when we do look forward, even though we don't know what's coming, we do expect our kids to be able to return to our schools in September, and we're going to need that support for them. So I did want to say that. And then in terms of what David had said about a little more detail, I know that we had discussed this at we did have to skip a budget meeting because of the public health emergency that we're all experiencing now. But in addition to the details he was looking for, I did want to ask again, as we are going to be thinking moving forward about expenditures in a very fluid situation, for a list of where those advisors are coming in. I had asked, for sort of a better understanding of who those might be and where they might be and what the regulations are, the school-based regulations for deciding who they are, only because we're going to need to be fully apprised of where our primary foci are next year. And I want to make sure I have that information available for future decisions. So thank you.
Can I ask a clarifying question, Beth? When you're speaking of the advisors, can you?
I don't have the page in front of me, so I'm looking for the language where we talked about.
You're speaking of a consideration.
Yeah, I'm looking for the primary and the secondary with the list, and so David had been speaking about getting more details about the PE piece. And here, I'm looking for...
Right here?
Yeah, advisor stipends, thank you.
So, yeah, and so there was a piece of it that I want to say that was to be defined. When we think about clubs and building our club and advisor stipends, there's pieces to it that are in flux from year to year. And I can certainly provide more information, but the one area that I think is notable that I want to highlight is that we were looking at developing a seal of biliteracy program for our high school students, so that when they graduate from high school, they'd actually receive a diploma that would speak to their biliteracy abilities. So we can certainly get more details on that. I can tell you that that has been an area that our world language department and our wonderful high school administration has been exploring with the district administration over the past year. So we can certainly give you some more details about what we're expecting in those areas, but the primary focus was going to be related to specifically that biliteracy initiative.
No, thank you. I had forgotten about that. Thank you for clarifying that again, but it was more about something that we had discussed at the last meeting about just getting an overview of, I guess, all the advisors we have at this point, because as we're moving into, I know we're deciding now for the budget for next year, that we have a sense of what we have now in addition to that piece.
Yeah.
I made
Yeah.
clear. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. So yeah, there's, and the other piece to it, my wonderful memory just began to work, that the other second piece was robotics. So we had IEF funded the robotics through a grant and was supporting robotics. So our commitment would be to take the robotics club on and have a staff advisor to support the growth of that program.
Mhm.
Which, David, it aligns back to your comments with respect to looking at our STEM work and all the work that we've done that's been so impressive in this district over time related to STEM, science research, and so on. And I do remember the conversation, Beth, and we reminded trustees that annually, all of our clubs and our advisors are appointed annually on agendas. So what we'll do is we'll just pull a list of all those different categories and we can forward it to the board in a regular committee.
That would be great, because otherwise we go back and we have to look back at all the agendas. I know that everyone is has so many responsibilities now in a very different world, dealing with it in a different way than we have before. But if we could get that would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
No problem.
Oh, and that's it for me. Thank you, Brian.
Erin?
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Carol and your team and Dr. Harrison for this. This is great. And it's a really good plan, as Carol said, and a way to start to think about what our spending will look like in future years. So I have a question. So as I look at slide 19, and we look at maximizing our tax cap, which is really just related to the first line on that schedule, which is the tax levy revenue. And if I'm hearing correctly, we're talking about maximizing that tax cap because we're worried about the state aid revenue on the line below it and the other revenue, which is driven by some sales tax and other items as well. So that's about 6.3 million. If we built the budget assuming the maximum impact on the tax cap and built the budget saying we don't know what state aid revenue is, so we built it in a little lower, knowing that Cuomo is going to give quarterly updates. And if during those quarterly updates we get more money than we anticipated, would we still be able to then add to our expenditure side, Carol, and buy the vehicle and add some of our other tier 2 suggestions? Or like what would happen in that case if the state aid money came in higher at that point? Because I feel like visually it might be easier for people to understand that this is really about us maximizing the tax levy because it's the only thing we have control over to offset other areas where we don't think we're going to come in where we would like.
So you really are not allowed to exceed your budget from any given year. You really can't outspend your budget. That would be a negative thing. Now, if your revenues were to exceed your budgeted revenues and you didn't end in a deficit position, I think you can make an argument for that, but that's why I'm advocating leaving them in, the considerations in and the money in for it, because you can't exceed your budget. So you voter approved this much expenditure. That's what you're allowed to expend. We've never ever exceeded a budget number, so I don't think that would be the right way to proceed. The right way to proceed is to keep our plan, our vision for what we wanted for the district prior to this, this pandemic happening, and then see how we can make things work if we can. Again, as I said, some things may be okay. Sales tax may rebound. The interest, we may have other ways of making some of that money up. The one I said I'm worried about is the state aid.
Okay.
And as Dr. Harrison mentioned, we're in a better position than other districts. You're going to see a lot of doom and gloom in other districts because they're more than 6% state aid. And it really starts to impact them. So I think with some careful planning, Erin, we should be able to weather this. But no, we should really keep the number in there and then determine how much we can spend as time goes on.
Okay, and then is it possible just to model out then because under the scenarios we have right now with the full levy, we're anticipating full state aid again in 21-22. Could we model out what it would look like if in reality we have the full tax levy, but not all of the state aid that we're anticipating, and what that sort of, surplus or deficit looks like in that scenario? Because I think just based on the conversations, and I mean, Colin was talking about doing quarterly budgets, it seems more likely that if we approve a budget of 65.257 million, we're not really going to get that in revenue because of the state aid that's in question.
Right, so revenue is almost always the hardest thing to forecast. So, we never really, there's a lot of things we don't know. We make a lot of assumptions when we do our revenue. I'm always a little conservative to begin with when I do my revenue forecast for the district, because I don't ever want to be in a position where we're going to end in a deficit. So as I talked about before. So like sales tax, I was already a little conservative, so we may be okay there. But that 500,000 that you see on the bottom is if we have a shortfall in revenue, is if we don't spend the expenditures. So that's what's giving us that leeway for going forward. And it's also assuming we have a pretty bad tax cap next year, or actually I wouldn't say pretty bad, a median, kind of a very median number. We've been in a higher number in the last couple of years. We could have a CPI factor that brings us more revenue next year. So, with that we won't know until about January. We have to see where the inflation is happening. There's just so much variability right now, but yeah, I can model just about anything. So.
Okay. And not to be doom and gloom, but after the Depression, there was deflation. So what would that look like if that were to happen for 21-22?
We can't. They won't go below zero. So they
won't. Okay.
CPI is zero. It's either 0 up to 2. It's never higher than 2, and it's never lower than 0.
Okay.
Yeah.
They have done away with the negative tax cap.
Yeah,
okay.
which we endured about 5 years ago.
Okay. I just
but
wanted to be
we
sure.
had one slide, Aaron, that spoke to that, demonstrated that if we had that zero growth, and then right here, that we'd be looking at only an increase of $37,000.
Okay. Okay. And I guess to everyone else's point, just understanding, because I don't think we're really talking about approving the tier 1 and tier 2 right now. We're sort of conceptually approving a gross revenue amount, but we probably do need to take some time to dig into what would be the things that we would want to approve for 21 or for 2021 in terms of priorities, and just understanding that in greater detail. That's it for me.
Thanks. I wasn't sure if you had paused or if you were done.
No, I'm done.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm not sleeping.
I'll just give a couple of my thoughts and comments, but before I do so, like everyone, again, thank you to Chris, Carol, Mary, and the rest of the team for tonight's presentation, and also want to thank not only our teachers, but also our building administrators, our psychologists, social workers, and everyone in the district who's working in these challenging times and dealing with now the new normal and plotting how we're going to deliver the best educational experience possible and support our students at the same time. So again, thank you on behalf of myself and the rest of the board for all of your efforts on the budget. I guess a couple thoughts. Just again, I think we all are mindful of the current situation and wanting to be conservative. I think in terms of our new considerations, we have to be mindful of ones that would be 1 year considerations, such as buying a truck, where the following year we then wouldn't have that expense, versus a continuing expense of adding a position which would carry on. So I think, at least I believe, that if we're going to add a position, it should be something that we believe is sustainable. And I know as a board last year in particular, we had a commitment to the world language program. And I think we all support that goal. But at the same time, if we can't have that be a sustainable program, we need to look at that and consider that, because we don't want to add something, as Dr. Harrison said, just to take it away a year later. So I think as we look towards our new considerations, we have to both look towards what is sustainable, but also figuring out what our greatest priorities are in terms of our district's needs and whether it's a truck or something else. So, I just wanted to put that out there as we look at the new considerations and think about the priorities and what we consider for next year. We keep that in mind. At the same time, it sounds like also for a lot of those, they're ones that we can also wait to see how things play out. We don't need to replace a scoreboard next month. It could be something that's looked at 6 months from now or 9 months from now, depending on where things play out. So there are, I think, different timings in terms of the considerations. And I think Dr. Harrison would be helpful. I think if we're looking at the different considerations and prioritizing them, thinking about which ones, if we weren't going to implement for the beginning of the school year, would be things that wouldn't make sense to implement down the road mid-year, such that those would be things that would automatically flow to reserves if we don't decide to move forward with them, as of August or September, whatever that zero barrier would be for them.
Got it.
So that's all I have for now. I think, as we all recognize, we'll have at least one more additional meeting on this, and if more are needed, we'll address that, so that way we can all get to a place where we're able to fully dig into both these new scenarios and also look at the potential appropriations going forward in terms of what we think makes sense as a board and a district to support.
Very good.
So with that, I think unless someone else has anything further to add on top of what others have said, if you do so, raise your hand and I'll call on you. I guess I feel like I'm back in elementary school with that one. So if anyone has anything further, show me your hand. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next topic. Okay, so thank you again. Moving forward, I think now we have a policy portion for approval. There was a request to table one of the policies, which is 4710, for additional discussion. So if we could remove that from tonight's agenda, but then talking about the other policies, if anyone has anything else to say about those before we approve the remaining policies. Hearing nothing, do we need to do a roll call for this, given how we're doing it? Or is it just...
No, I think we're in a good position where if you call a normal vote, Pauline is able to hear everyone. We're in good shape. When you vote aye, just raise your hand so she gets that double verification.
So aye.
Well, we asked for your motion.
Oh, sorry. See, I got ahead of myself. Can we have a motion to approve?
Are we doing this before we pull it out? I don't understand.
We pulled it out.
I already pulled it out.
Well, so we're not voting on that particular 4710?
Correct. 4710 is out. So we're voting on everything other than 4710. So can I get a motion to approve all policies listed on tonight's agenda other than 4710?
So moved.
Second, someone? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so now we'll move on to our consent agenda. And are there any questions on the consent agenda before we move on that?
And with there being no question, Brian, if I could just make comment that in this, we're appointing an interim assistant director of PPS. Please note that this date is retro to March 17th because if you recall, when we look, Ms. Lockhart would have been appointed back at that date originally. So I emergency appointed her because her services were needed in district. So we're thrilled to be able to welcome her to partner with Ms. Krieger and the rest of our staff across the district. She's been here doing tremendous work since that time. She brings with her a tremendous wealth of knowledge and experience that's already proved to be invaluable. You'll see there's a shift in the order of some of our agenda items, that if you see that we have business of the board is actually following personnel when it typically precedes it. I deliberately organized the agenda in such a fashion because we are appointing Ms. Lockhart also as a CSE chairperson, but I needed you to hire her first as an employee before we gave her additional employee responsibilities. So that's I wanted to explain for the board and the public the rationale for that shift from traditional organization of our agenda.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. And with that, can I get a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
So, second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
So as part of tonight's consent agenda, we again thank the PTSA for their grants for the BioBus and embracing your vision both at the high school. There was a donation to the Zachary Kamen Scholarship Fund from Doug Kamen, and we thank you for that. And with that, our next public meeting will be on April 14th, likely through a similar online format. So be on the lookout for an invite for our next meeting. And with that, can I get a motion to adjourn tonight's meeting?
So moved.
So moved. Second?
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, everyone, for tonight's participation, and we'll see you again next time in a virtual way.
Thank you. Bye.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you for everybody making this a success. Appreciate it.